examines collaborative approaches involving community organizations and stakeholders that have the potential to improve academic achievement and reduce opportunity gaps for students in urban and rural schools. We're joined, actually in the room with me right now, is Dr. Jessica Gottlieb. She's an assistant professor of STEM education here at Texas Tech University's College of Education. Her research focuses on how educational policy can be used to increase equity and access of high-quality STEM education opportunities. We're very fortunate to also be joined by Mr. Bob Popinski. He is the Director of Policy at Raise Your Hand, Texas. He is an expert on the Texas school finance system. He has provided in-depth bill and policy analysis during the past 7 legislative sessions and throughout the state's 2 most recent school finance court cases. And we're also joined by Dr. Michelle Smith, also from Raise Your Hand, Texas, who is the Director of Government Relations. She connects policy, research, and classroom experience to offer innovative approaches to the challenges in education policy in Texas. I'm also very proud to say that many of us on the panel today have also worked in the classroom and in schools, so we bring both the inside as well as the larger community perspective to our discussion on education policy. If our panelists are ready, I'd like to jump right in with our first question and just ask each of you if you could briefly comment on what changes you expect to see in Texas education policy resulting from the recent election. And then we will have approximately a half hour for our panelists to discuss those comments as well as some other questions related to the key areas that we are focusing on for this webinar, specifically related to school finance, school choice, immigration and shifting demographics, teacher workforce, and the politics of education policy. When we have about 20 minutes left, we will have an opportunity for some Q&A with those who are attending the webinar who might not be speakers. We will be monitoring the chat in this webinar, so please feel free to use that as a way to submit questions, and then we will address as many of those as possible during the Q&A time. So maybe I could start by asking Mr. Hinojosa if you could kick us off and give us just a brief overview of what changes you expect to see in Texas education policy in the upcoming legislative session.
All right, well, thanks very much, Alex. Very happy to be here with the other distinguished panelists. So I think, what's interesting is, people were talking about whether or not there was going to be a blue wave. Some of us people who have been doing this work for a long time probably thought, well, that's, high hopes for that in some respects. But not sure if you're picking up that.
We can hear you.
Okay. So, there wasn't that blue wave exactly here, right? But there definitely were some really strong ripples along the way. And what does that mean for public education? Because 10 Democrats, we're nonpartisan at IDRA, but Democrats do tend to support public education. The issue of school privatization is a little different because you do have the vouchers and neo-vouchers, definitely on one side of that, but you also have through school privatization our charter schools. Those are privately operated charter schools for the most part in Texas, where you have had mixed Democrat and Republican supporting, despite the cost to public education for supporting those other efforts. So I think just speaking on the issue of school privatization, I do think that some of that momentum has been taken out, even though they haven't been successful, for the school voucher and neo-voucher movement over the years that's been supported largely, in the Texas Senate, much more difficult in the Texas House. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult in the Texas House now. With respect to equitable schooling, if we're talking about equitable school finance, I mean, that's been a challenge of Texas, going back to 1993, 94, when some of the more progressive legislation was passed. But many of that was never came to be realized fully. So we still have, large gaps of almost $1,000 between the wealthiest school districts in Texas versus the poorest. Even through some of the efforts that were made during the last round in the 2017 session with House Bill 21, that a lot of people had a lot of promise for. From an equity standpoint, it wasn't entirely great. Now, it was a little better, but it still wasn't great. And that's because of the lack of investment overall in public education funding for the state of Texas. So that will still remain a big challenge unless the state wants to fork over larger revenue sources. I don't see a lot of promise there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Just to follow up on that, since you were talking about towards the end of that equitable school finance, Mr. Popinski, if you would be willing to talk to us next about what you expect in the upcoming legislative session regarding Texas education policy. Given your school finance background, maybe that's a good segue.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on. Well, for the last year or so, the School Finance Commission appointed by the governor, lieutenant governor, and the speaker have been meeting in earnest to try to come up with a different way to do school finance. And so what happened during the last election is school finance got nudged a little bit more towards the center. Ross Ramsey has a good article out this morning. It's called All Texas Politics is National. And he talks about it's time for kind of less red meat and more meat and potatoes. And I think that's what they're going to try to do this legislative session. And you start with school finance. Now, school finance has different meanings to different people. So for a good portion of the House and the Senate, school finance might mean property tax relief. For the other portion of the bodies, it might mean more investment in public schools. And what the School Finance Commission is doing right now, and they're still meeting with a month left until the report is due, is trying to balance that somehow. And so their recommendations so far is to basically repeal $5 billion of existing formula funding, pump that into some new formulas. Some of those new formulas may be good, some of them may be bad. Some of them that raise your hand may get behind or may see as good policy is flowing additional funding to higher densities of economically disadvantaged students. Other policies where you're incentivizing third grade reading and performance on the STAR exam and getting an additional weight per student once your third grader passes the STAR exam may not be the best policy. And so those are the formulas they're trying to weigh at this point. But in the background, kind of the third thing they're dealing with is all through the school finance system is property tax relief. How much property tax relief are they going to give, and how much of the state resources are going to be needed to give property tax relief? If you remember back in 2006, they did three basic things, right? They reduced property taxes from $1.50 down to $1. They gave a teacher incentive program, the DATE program, and they gave a high school allotment. And so at the end of the day, that's what you're looking at again, is kind of history repeating itself. They're looking at some sort of property tax relief. They're looking at some sort of funding towards a grade level, in this case, third grade, and they're looking to do incentive pay for teachers. And so that's kind of the base of where we are. Now, once we get into the session, we'll see what happens, but it'll probably play out very similar to what it did in 2006.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Since you're right here in the room with me, and you do work with issues related to policy and teachers as well, could you talk a little bit, Dr. Gottlieb, about what some of your expectations are?
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely echo my two co-panelists and their predictions. I think what I would predict is the broader theme of just incremental policy. Mike Petrilli just wrote an article talking about how the age of really dramatic education reform maybe is slowing down a little bit, and we're seeing more of an emphasis on practice and tinkering with the existing structures in place. And I think what my panelists described is exactly that. Rethinking some of these formulas, rethinking compensation, but I'm not expecting big or dramatic education legislation to come out of this session.
Good, thank you. I appreciate that. Could I also, Dr. Smith, I know you're there somewhere. Could you
I'm
talk
here.
a little bit about, oh, wonderful. Could you talk a little bit about what your expectations are from the government relations side of things?
Sure, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. I'm actually in the car driving back from Houston, so I'll mute when I'm not talking, just to spare everybody the road noise. So Bob and I worked together at Raise Your Hand Texas. He did a great job of explaining, the policy perspective of it, and I come at it from the political perspective, which is what can we get done this session. And David did a great job of saying that there wasn't a blue wave, and we just wrote an article at Raise Your Hand that said that, there wasn't a red wave. There may have been a red wave, there may have been a blue wave, but there was definitely a public education wave that we're seeing legislators moved more toward the middle of the room and seeing more legislators that are supportive of their public schools, which for Raise Your Hand is a wonderful thing. And so they've heard from the voters that people want more public education, they want more money for teachers, and then they, like Bob said, they want property tax relief. And so during the session, it will come down to a trade, definitely, of how much money are we talking about, how much money is going to go to property tax relief, and how much money is going to go to education. And so you'll start seeing people kind of put their stake in the ground as far as, when we're talking about new money for education, in order for everybody to sign on, it's got to be significant new money for education. So if it's just $1 billion for incentives programs, or a amount for teachers, I think that people will be very disappointed at the end of session if that's all we get. So the pressure is on for legislators to talk about significant new money, and they're going to have to decide whether they want to look at new revenue sources or expanding the revenue sources that they currently have. So it's going to be interesting to watch. I don't know that we can get that done in a regular session. People are starting to talk about the need for a special session. And so it may be a long game, it may be a long summer, but I am cautiously optimistic that we'll get something done.
Well, that's good. I love the optimism. I'm glad we have that, and I'm glad that things look that direction. Dr. Childs, could I bring you in? And since a lot of the work that you do looks at how policies connect with local communities, how would you sort of round out some of these expectations from your colleagues, and then what do you expect to see in the upcoming session?
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for having me. Can you hear me? Am I good?
Yes, you're great.
Great.
Excellent. So yeah, some really amazing points brought out by the other panelists. And for me, what I've been most interested in following, and it's been since I believe 2 legislature sessions ago, is seeing how school districts respond, particularly as it relates to the recent release of the school financial accountability rating system. And so what that means in terms of them making amendments to their district of innovation plan. So currently in Texas, I believe there's about 799 or just somewhere around 799 districts that have been approved to implement or be designated as a district of innovation. And so I think what will be interesting to see over the next couple of months and year is how districts respond not only from local pressure or desires, but also from messages, both spoken and also unspoken, from the State House and also from TEA. And so I think what we'll see is a continuation of the movement towards almost like a public choice-ish type system. And so I think that has lots of implications for districts that are near or surround large city school districts in the state. And so for me, I think that's going to be most fascinating. I think everyone is going to be paying attention, and for obvious and clear reasons, to what happens with school finance and what happens in terms of the rainy day fund and everything. But for me, I think a lot of this stuff is what's going to happen at the local level. What are school boards, and to some extent city councils, what are people at the local level going to do when it comes to the day-to-day education of students in our state? And for me, that's most fascinating. I think that will play out in some of these amendments that districts are going to post or put together as it relates to their districts of innovation plans.
Well, thank you all for those overviews. It's really helpful. And I know that we have some prepared questions that we talked about discussing, and I have some, I want to modify them a little bit just given some of your comments. But I wanted to ask before we moved on, since a lot of you talked about issues related to school finance, you talked about some of the, maybe contradiction is too strong a word, but the pulling in different directions of, do we want choice? Do we want equitable schooling? Do we want, to support funding at greater levels, or do we want reduced property tax? So these are obviously things that we deal with every session and all the time. However, I'm wondering if with the particular results of the recent election in Texas and some of the changes you might expect to see on the public education committees in the House and the Senate, are there particular, Bob, I think you got the most specific on this, but are there particular directions you see those policies or those discussions, I should say, heading as we move forward? It was a long question. I can restate it if you'd like.
No, absolutely. No, I think the major thrust right now is to, number one, not do an across-the-board teacher pay raise, right? They want to incentivize teachers based on the STAR exam. And right now, one of the policy recommendations, both by the governor and by the School Finance Commission, is to phase in over a 10-year period, $100 million per year, an incentive structure, kind of like the Dallas ISD ACE program, that would allow school districts to fund or an additional $10,000 per teacher. Now, if you think kind of on the whole base level, there's 350,000 teachers in the state on average making $52,000. $100 million a year does not get you very far. It gets you about 3% of the teachers along the way. So some of the pushback you're going to be seeing on this one is how do we fund our teachers at an adequate level? Because that kind of goes against kind of just funding school districts need to keep up with inflation, healthcare costs, other needs that they don't have. Overall, Texas ranks 43rd in the nation when it comes to average per pupil spending. We spend about $8,500 in operations spending per student. The national average is $11,500. So we're behind the times on inflation. And the school finance system is such a big system in Texas. It's about $50 billion a year. Just to keep up with inflation is about $1 billion, $1.5 billion per year. So you're talking about $3 billion, $3.5 billion you need in a biennial budget just to keep up with inflation. And as David mentioned and others mentioned, the economy is doing well. We just saw this week that they put some more money into the rainy day fund at historic levels, $12.5 billion. Senator Betancourt and others are actually thinking for the first time that they might use this fund for education funding. Now, in their minds, education funding, as we mentioned, is kind of property tax relief. If we can pivot that to other programs, whether it's teacher pay or other formula adjustments to direct funding towards innovative programs, I think that would be a win in the end for public education.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to give other speakers a chance to respond as well. Did anyone else want to chime in?
I'll say one thing, and it's not going to necessarily deal with the financial aspect of that, because I think you have some really great people who can speak more to that. But I'm kind of interested. Do we see another kind of teacher spring when these next legislature sessions begin? In January, right? Do we see another teacher spring 19, right, where we saw walkouts across the country in places like West Virginia, Arizona, Oklahoma, which were supposed to bring in a wave or a somewhat new direction in a lot of these states when it came to teacher education policy and what it meant for educating public schools in these states, and really we didn't see much change in some of these states. So will we see another example, or I'm sorry, not another example, another kind of teacher spring when the next session starts? I don't think it would happen here in Texas, but I think if we see another groundswell across the nation, I think Texas will be in this unique position where, how will Texas respond, right? And how will the legislature respond? And so for me, I think that the politics of it all, I think it is most fascinating to me. I think has something to be said come the next legislature session, excuse me.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually had a similar comment. I am really interested in the way that these teacher incentive plans start to look at the local level and the variation we might see across districts. Having the benefit of hindsight, kind of looking at districts that have been doing this since Race to the Top and really thinking about what these models could look like, should look like, and how that might impact labor markets at the same time that we are seeing this wave of teacher activism in neighboring states in reaction to working conditions, low pay, etc. So I'm really excited to see what that variation looks like and what those local politics look like when they're translated into practice.
This is David. I want to add a couple of things, especially around the teacher issue, because the Texas School Finance Commission again is considering some of these quote unquote efficiency based spending, so they don't want to necessarily throw money at the problem, but they're willing to throw money at a bad solution. And this has historically been the problem with Texas school finance system, where you have funding that is based on, for example, the high school allotment. So the way to try and prevent dropouts is by paying schools that graduate more students more money. That didn't necessarily, work out very well there, and now they're looking at maybe transferring some of those funds into another set of funds. But the bottom line here is that if you're not, we have a teacher shortage in Texas, right? We have a lot of alternatively certified based teachers in Texas, and I'm not saying that they're necessarily the bad apples in the system, because there's a lot of great teachers who come out of there, but there's a lot of struggling teachers who come out of those alternatively certified programs. There's a lot of struggling teachers who come out of traditional university-based teacher programs, and they're ill-prepared to educate our Texas children who are in the Texas public schools today. And so if you end up having these incentives, such as Dallas ISD, let's pretend that Dallas ISD doesn't have a teacher attrition problem, and maybe we can start talking about whether or not we should, increase in scope, some of those policy recommendations that are flowing from Commissioner Morath and his prior role there at Dallas ISD. It's not like Dallas ISD is a bed of opportunity and success, but yet that's the way they're casting it. And if we're going to continue to try and look at something and say, well, this sounds good, but does it really look good? Does the research behind it speak well of these policies? And it's probably not going to do that. In fact, it's going to be nothing. Speaking of the labor market from a different perspective, how many people, how many graduates out there is it going to push into the teaching profession? Because now, if they're one of the top 3% of teachers in their school district from one year to the next, because it can change drastically, is that going to necessarily drive people into the teaching profession? Is that going to help support those teachers who need it most? Probably not.
One of the things that go ahead.
This is Michelle. I was just going to add one thought to the differentiated teacher pay issue, is that the structure of the program that most people in the legislature are talking about is putting our highest quality teachers in our hardest to teach classrooms, and a lot of Texas is rural instead of urban, and so if they're going to put a differentiated teacher pay model in place, they're going to have to take special consideration for our small school districts that may only have one campus. And so I think local flexibility is going to be key if they're going to get this thing to the finish line, that school districts would be able to develop their own programs to pay their teachers how they want to pay them, and then just jump through the hoops that are required by the agency and receive those funds. So it's not like one size is going to fit all. They try mandated approach to differentiated teacher pay.
So one of the things that I find fascinating about the perspective that I think many of you are bringing to this conversation is this, well, we're recognizing that Texas is large and diverse. That's sort of a given, and that there's not a one-size-fits-all policy approach, especially when it comes to school finance or serving the diverse populations, especially with the shifting demographics or changes in immigration that have happened over the past several years. My question is, following the previous election, several of you said that we saw a move more towards getting things done, momentum towards the middle rather than the right. Does this suggest that there will be a renewed focus on making sure that the needs of all of the communities across Texas are met, or will there still be some challenges for those communities who are rural, who are experiencing the biggest teacher shortages, who are in pockets where it's perhaps high cost of living but low income? Do we see that, or do you anticipate that will be part of the agenda for our legislator moving forward? Again, feel I've asked a more complicated question.
No, I know. This is Bob. I'll step into this one. The answer is right now, no. In fact, what the School Finance Commission actually did was remove the small and mid-sized school adjustment, an adjustment the small schools really depend on, and they moved it outside of kind of the basic allotment structure so they don't really see the benefit from it. Most of the conversations they're talking about benefit kind of poor urban school districts, which is where most of our population is. But the problem is we have 80% of the school districts out there that have 5,000 students or less. And so how do you get those programs moving? And they really haven't addressed that yet. So I hope to see them pivot at some point to talk about it. Even in their property tax relief plan, it would benefit urban and suburban areas more than rural districts. So they have a lot of work to do when it comes to that.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to pause in case anyone else wanted to chime in on that.
I'll just add that a lot will depend on who the speaker is. If the speaker comes from West Texas, for example, or even East Texas, a rural area, more rural areas, then that's probably going to get a lot of attention. You do already have some senators who are sympathetic and sit on the public education committee to those certain regions. So I think even during the last session when there was a small bump in that benefited rural school districts in the formulas that was on the ballot there, that was largely supported. So there's a lot of representatives, especially in the House side, who represent rural school districts, and if they get a speaker that's supporting them, then they can go a long way there.
Mm-hmm. I want to, at this point, for those of you who are joining us on this webinar and would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the chat function on our Skype connection to submit any questions that you have, and we're monitoring those on our end, and we'll be able to ask those of our panelists in just a few minutes. I wanted to sort of point us in another direction. In many ways, I'm asking those of you who are joining us as speakers to sort of see into the future and tell us what hasn't happened yet. But I'm interested in thinking about, or asking you to think about, a couple of things. One is, since we've seen some shift in the voters' inclinations towards what they'd like to see, it's been a significant shift, at least a noticeable shift from what we've seen in past elections. Is that a trend that you expect to carry forward, or that will carry forward not only through this legislative session but beyond? Do you see any indicators of that being true? I also wonder if there is anything specific. We've talked a little bit about teacher incentives. We've talked about some of the problems with not having enough teachers or teacher shortages. Is there anything related to teacher preparation or educator preparation that we expect will be an issue in the next session or beyond as well? So 2 questions for you there.
This is Michelle. I'll speak to the elections issue. I think that as predicted right now, I think that this shift toward the middle and more toward the left is going to continue in the next election cycle, predominantly because of who our president is right now. Mm-hmm. And I think it'll also depend on if Beto O'Rourke honestly decides to run as well. That there were people in Texas that either lost their elections or unexpectedly won their elections due to Beto being on the ballot, and also people's frustration with our current president. And so we expect for that time around.
Thank you. Was there something else? I'm sorry. I think I lost the sound just for a second. Nope. Okay. What about for the teacher workforce? Or teacher preparation? Do we see anything specifically related to that might be coming up? It's a selfish question. I sit in a college of education. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think we're going to continue to see high levels of alternatively certified teachers, and particularly late hire alternatively certified teachers getting placed in high needs schools, high needs districts. You know, as long as there's a shortage of teachers, particularly in those high demand subject areas, schools are going to look for bodies, right? They're going to get people in as fast as they can. And I think until that kind of supply and demand problem is resolved, I don't expect a lot of changes or increased regulation around that.
And oh, go ahead, David, you might. Yeah, I'll go real quick, which is, and I'm going to speak to something else. I think also, though, a lot of, while the state tends to focus a lot on, and our conversation is focused on teachers, I think leaders and principal preparation and those who run our school district and schools is also going to be something that might come up, and we might see over the next election cycle or two, particularly because UCA, which is the University Council of Educational Administration, just released a report that saw that our state, Texas, had an overproduction of certified principals who are within our state, right? And so you have very capable school leaders now that are in our state that are looking for work. And the question is does Texas care about quantity or quality, right? And so what does the quality of our educational leaders and our educational leadership preparation programs going to look like, right? And then how does that, trickle down or manifest itself in our public education system and our schools, right? Which we know then impacts teachers and teachers' quality of life and quality of work, kind of what Jessica was talking about earlier. So I think we can't and we shouldn't get in the conversation, or we shouldn't separate the conversation around teachers without also a full conversation and diving into the role of leaders and those in charge of running our buildings and districts and so forth. And so I just wanted to add that other kind of nuanced piece to this.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is David. I will say that I'm not very hopeful for any substantive changes going on in teacher preparation programs. Like I said, we have a huge gap between what our student population looks like and what our teaching population looks like. Texas, among the 11 southern states in our region of our Equity Assistance Center that I direct here at IDRA, has the largest gap among all the states. Now, we do have the largest minority student population, or the population of students of color across the South as well, but we still have, this continuing gap. And I'm not saying that the gap itself, that race itself would matter in how successful a teacher can be with students, but it does matter in many respects. And the colleges of education have not been very responsive to these changing demographics. They haven't been taken into account the real student needs that are coming in. And I'm talking about issues of classroom management that is more asset-based than deficit-based, not looking at children and families from underserved communities through a heavy deficit lens. I'm talking about the issue of implicit and explicit bias, and this goes for our English learners students as well. And the issue of culturally responsive pedagogy and training. So I mean, our colleges shouldn't necessarily need legislation to move in that direction, but unfortunately, I'm not sure if they're going to do it themselves, because many of them, I'm not saying all of them, many of them are just used to doing things the way that they were taught and don't really want to change much. And that's a sore area of need in the Texas public education system, but I don't think it'll get a whole lot of attention.
David, this is Fernando Valle. I'm faculty at Texas Tech University in the Educational Leadership Program, and I do want to echo your work and your comments. I've been fortunate to be part of the Principal Preparation 268 and 968 pilot work with TEA as one of the faculty, as many are across the state, and looking at the rigor of the new principal as instructional leader exam and the content and the work of the PASL, Performance Assessment of School Leader. I was in several meetings where what you just commented came to life. Preparation programs, colleges, universities, region centers, profits, nonprofits, all of the landscape of who is able to provide principal certification. There was a lot of conversation of who is going to lead that charge of post status quo work that was our mid-management from 20 years ago, right? Who is going to jump in? What universities are going to be at the forefront? What role is districts going to have in acquiring instructional leaders that can not only meet the challenges of not having teachers, of the accountability system, but serving the needs of, for example, English learners across the state of Texas? And that is a very prominent conversation that I hope that as TEA collects pilot data on 968 this upcoming January from across the state of Texas in administrators, not only current, but past, and those that are graduating, and they can really create that momentum to rise to the challenge. I'm hopeful, as you say, and I'm also hopeful, I'm going to be very honest, that programs that aren't rising to the situation or cannot meet the needs of our students in schools are also looked at by TEA, and like anything else, looked at to see what part they can do to help improve that. So thank you for your comments. I really appreciate them.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Valle. We have a question from Levi Johnson that I wanted to share. Levi says, I perceive TEA and various state legislators as being very interested in seeing dual credit and enrollment programming continue to expand in Texas schools, for example, P-TECH grants. Do you expect this sort of work to get more attention this legislative session? I'll open that up to whoever wants to comment on that.
Hi, this is Bob again. Yes, Senator Seliger actually held hours and hours worth of hearings this past interim on the issue of dual credit, specifically transferability and the dual credit rigor. And at the end of the day, except for a few people, the consent was that dual credit programs work and they would like to expand them. The problem is, how do you get more students involved in taking courses that kind of make sense in a scope and sequence sort of thing, so that when they do move on, they actually count towards their degree? And I think that's what they're wrestling with right now. Back a few months ago, the Education Agency and the Higher Education Coordinating Board released the dual credit program kind of statewide goals that's supposed to be in the memorandum of understanding between the institutions. And that will hopefully help set up kind of better guidelines for dual credit programs. But I do think you're going to see something happen this legislative session. You all saw the dueling dual credit reports that were out this summer. I think some of the debate will continue, but I don't think it'll be over whether dual credits are good or bad. I think the consensus is that they're good and that they want to expand them.
Thank you. Any other responses to that before we move on? Well, let me ask you, so one of the things that I have a special role being at a university. I get to sort of play on all sides of the fence. And a lot of times I have a chance to meet with policymakers at the district and state level directly. And some of the things that I get asked, well, the one question I get asked more than any other is what are some programs or what are some policies in other states that we could be using in Texas? And I'm wondering from those of you on our panel, I know that you're experts in Texas-specific education policy and practice. What I'd love to know is there somewhere that our policy makers and our legislators should be looking or are looking, and is that an effective way to think about policy changes, or is that not even on the table?
This is David. I'll go ahead and start us off. So I do want to say that I have drafted an essential building blocks on for state school finance reform with the Learning Policy Institute based out of California. And as part of that work, I looked at the best practices of states in school finance all across the country. And, there were 3 different states that I highlighted in the report. One was Massachusetts, one was New Jersey, and the other one was Minnesota. And, they each have their own really great things. None of them are perfect, but in trying to bridge policy and practice with funding, I think they do a much better job than most of the other states, and their achievement scores, seem much better than most of the other states. So I think that that's definitely an opportunity, for the state to look at. Of course, that's a big thing. I would say that there's some other states out there, including South Carolina and others, that have had equity-based grow your own teacher programs that have been supported by the state level. And I emphasize equity-based because not all grow your own programs are equity-based, and those are some definite opportunities as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Have any of you, other speakers, experienced or had other systems or examples from other states introduced as potential solutions or ideas for Texas that you thought were interesting, or do you think that's a mistake?
This is Angela. Can y'all hear me?
Oh, hey.
Hello? This is Angela.
Introduce yourself, Angela.
Hi there, everybody. I've been listening, and I missed the first few minutes of this discussion, but yeah, I just want to echo that there are really good models for Grow Your Own that are equity-based. Grow Your Own Illinois was funded at the state level. I think Torlakson in California has a paraprofessional pipeline that he's funding for teachers there. I don't have the specifics on that, but I'm aware of it. And he's a superintendent of public schools. And I think also, based on what really the work that I was able to do with David as part of the Equity Center, there are numerous models, and it would be wonderful to explore in conversation with like-minded folks about what we could devise locally, and essentially these become funding streams to colleges and universities. They could be to nonprofits, but it would be for creating pathways into teaching, and it would be for, if they're equity-based, typically for students of color that come from, schools, high-need schools with great teachers, great mentorship opportunities, great induction into higher ed, with the idea that these young people go back into teaching, and you guarantee them a certain number of years, and it taps into a motivation that is not frequently tapped into. A desire to give back to your own community is what is tapped into, that suggests really the power of this program through partnerships and pathways, specific pathways that are created into teaching. We need pathways into everything, right? But I think if we can at least start pathways into into teaching, so that we really get a community-based social justice kind of focus. It would transform. It does transform higher education, and it creates that sustainability in the community for teachers who are doing what they want to do. So it taps into all those motivations and addresses simultaneously the retention issue, which is, of course, also a crisis in so many of our school districts, just keeping teachers in the classroom. So yeah, a strong plug for that. Thanks for bringing that up, David. And then what I missed was the assessment piece. Maybe did y'all bring it up? What is going to be pursued this next legislative session? And I'm thinking of really great models that are out there, like the New York Performance Standards Consortium schools. I'm thinking of Kentucky with portfolio-based assessment. So any leads on that would be really helpful. I'll have about 20 students working this session, working on legislation, tracking bills, and so I want to give them all kinds of, tasks, put them to work, so that they can hopefully weigh in, either with community or directly with, with legislators. As such.
Yeah, that's a good question, Angela. Anything assessment related that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, no, I haven't heard anything about assessment changes, but I did want to make a plug for the Grow Your Own in rural communities as well, and thinking about the tremendous problems with retention and recruitment that they face in the teacher labor markets there, and really thinking about how we, I speak as a university professor, how we can support communities in recruiting and developing local talent that's invested in a community that might be remote or far from a big city. I just kind of want to throw that out there as well.
Thank you. So we only have about 5 minutes left, and we've spent pretty much our whole hour so far talking about what we've seen in the past and what we anticipate coming up as a result of the politics and the elections that have been in place and where it's going in this legislative session. I kind of like to ask the magic wand question, since most of you who are speakers for us today work for organizations that have some points and agendas that you advocate for. If you were able to wave the magic wand over this coming legislative session and there was, let's say, 1 or 2 major agenda items that moved forward, what would you like to see? What do you think is in the best interest of Texas students, educators, communities as we move forward?
This is Michelle. I'll jump in first. Of course, we want to see significant new money for education, but my ask of every legislator that I talk to is, if the whole school finance conversation falls apart for some reason this session, to at least one full day, high quality, formula funded pre-K.
Thank you.
We've got to get we've got to get all of our kids ready to learn when they walk in the door for kindergarten, and pre-K is the best bet that we have.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Yep.
This is Josh Childs. I'll go real quick, which is, 3 years ago or so, the state moved to decriminalize truancy. And for me, I think it's important to think about, you've moved to decriminalize it. Now, how does the state support schools and districts in ensuring that students attend school every day? I think the issues that we talk about in ed policy, whether it be around assessments, curriculum, teacher or leadership preparation, are all fine, but none of it really matters unless kids are attending school and are sitting in a seat every day, right? And so for me, I think it's important, if I could wave a magic wand, is seeing how the state invests in really trying to address issues of attendance that you see across our districts across the state, right? Especially in light that by the end of this month, ESSA, which is a national education policy law, is requiring all states to report their attendance numbers, right, in their state report cards. And so I think it's important, or at least to me, it's important that the state continues to think about, like, now we've decriminalized truancy. Now what can we do to support our schools and districts in ensuring that students are attending school every day?
Thank you, Dr. Childs.
So I can go.
Sure.
I would love to see a teacher incentive structure that aligns with teacher motivations. It's pegged to actual measures of teacher quality that are under the teacher's control, and that is large enough to be meaningful to a sizable number of teachers.
Wonderful. Anyone else want to dream big?
Yeah, this is David. Oh, well, if I'm going to dream big, I would say equitable and adequate school funding for all kids, and that is student need based. But I will say, more realistically, if we can at least move the bar on funding for English learners, the weight is the same as it was established in 1984 when we were doing the TOS testing, or TABS testing, sorry, I think it was. And we're much further beyond that. And the funding for English learners does so many different things, not just for improving the quality of education and opportunity for those kids in the classroom, but it also will have other impacts on property values, because the way that state does it by dividing it by the weighted average daily attendance. So if we could do that and raise that level of funding for the third tier in the school finance system that's known as the copper funding, and bring that at least within the last 2 to 3 years, since it's been stuck at 2006 levels ever since, those would be two great things the legislature could do.
Thank you. Well, I want to give anybody else a chance to, on our panel, to add anything else before we move on. But let me just say that it's been a real pleasure having a chance to have this conversation with you, and for your insight, and for your really the magic wand at the end is always one of the most exciting things for me. You can tell I've asked this question before, because it gives us a chance to build on and see what is feasible versus what we can do, and to really innovate. And I want to say that here at Texas Tech, we're dedicated to thinking about ways to innovate, bringing policy to practice, and creating opportunities for learners across all spectrums. So it really blends into our mission as well. I want to specifically thank Dr. Childs, Dr. Gottlieb, Mr. Popinski, Dr. Smith, and Mr. Hinojosa for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to talk to us today. These are, I'm just going to sound biased here, but wonderful professionals doing very strong work. And it's a real honor to have a chance to talk with you today. I also wanted to say that we will have a recording of this webinar that will be available on our website in the near future. We will have a chance to, we'll share that information back out. If you would like to, you can follow me on Twitter at ComparativeEDUC. You can follow the Texas Tech College of Education at TTU Education, and that will also give you more news about upcoming webinars and other events that we're involved in. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to our next conversation.